Is the United States still a superpower? Is it the greatest military in the world? Over the past few hours, the House of Representatives has passed a $886 billion defense bill. That doesn't account for the hundreds of billions of dollars they don't tell you about. This will go to President Biden's desk to be signed. Presumably, it should make Americans feel safer, right? It should propel us to superhero status in the United States. But it looks like it's done the opposite of that, as our U.S. southern border is like a sieve. Tens of thousands of people pouring across the border every day, bridges crumbling, tent cities across the United States. The de-dollarization of the United States dollar is happening in real time. Just listen to Vladimir Putin at a major press conference over the past few days talking about the de-dollarization. Was 87% of all transactions in Russia, now down to 20%. So is the United States still a superpower? Let's ask Colonel Douglas MacGregor. He's the CEO of OurCountryOurChoice.com, retired combat veteran and Sec Defense advisor under President Trump. Colonel, great to see you. Happy holidays to you and Merry Christmas.
Same to you, Clayton.
So I'll ask you, and I'll start there. I mean, it's a very broad sort of 35,000-foot question, but when you see this National Defense Authorization Act, $886 billion, and Americans are struggling to put food on their table right now, should Americans feel safer that their government has just spent that amount of money to shovel to the Pentagon?
Clayton, this is probably a good time for a retrospective. We're headed into the end of the year. And if we look back on the last 2.5 years of the Biden administration, we can actually go further than that. But certainly if we just focus on the time since Biden took office, there's a legitimate question about the current strength and power of the United States, both internally as a society and externally as an actor on the world stage. And there's a real question about our future. Where are we really headed? And I think the answer is nowhere good. We are actually in a rapid decline as a great power. The problem is we have a government similar to the scene in The Wizard of Oz, with the little man behind the curtain who is manipulating lights and images in front of everyone. And suddenly the little dog runs over, pulls the curtain back, and the people discover, oh my God, there's nothing behind any of this. I think we're getting close to it. We're not there yet because still the majority of Americans are not really paying attention to what happens overseas. In fact, too many of them are not paying attention to what's going on inside the country. A lot of them are beginning finally to notice the rising criminality, the human trafficking, the drug crisis because of the open borders. But still, there are too many Americans who are sitting comfortably watching football and trying to find out about Taylor Swift's love life. And when someone brings bad things up, too many of them are saying, well, it's not really my problem. It is their problem. They live inside this country. They can't ignore the plight of people on the Texas border, the people in southern Arizona, and the people in southern California, but we do. And at the same time, we have to go back and look at this terrible war that's occurred in Ukraine. What has happened in Ukraine? Everything that we have predicted, and I'm talking about the government and its minions and its supporters in the mainstream media, has failed. All of the advice that we have given to the Ukrainians, all of the equipment that we have given to them, none of it has worked. It's all failed miserably. I think of at least 1 billion plus people around the world who pay attention. America is weak. America looks vapid. And then we have this president who has trouble grinding out 2 or 3 coherent sentences. And we just listened to President Putin of the Russian state speak for over 4 hours. He delivers a speech and then he speaks extemporaneously for hours, answering questions for hours without notes because he has command of the information, command of the material. That's one of the big reasons that Putin has such support inside of Russia. He's a highly intelligent man, and he is absolutely committed to what is in the best interest of Russia. And he's done everything in his power to avoid a war with the United States and NATO, while we have done everything we possibly could to provoke him and continue to do so. In the meantime, you've got over 500,000 Ukrainian dead lying on the battlefields. I don't know how many civilians have died. How many millions have left the country? It's probably well over the 14 million that we saw a few months ago. The Ukrainian nation is effectively dead. It's comatose. I don't think it's even on life support. The people who are on life support in Kyiv, those are the crooks and the criminals running the country. They're about to receive another infusion of American cash that they no doubt will transfer to their bank accounts on Cyprus and Switzerland and elsewhere. How much of that will make any difference to the poor human beings dying on the battlefield is impossible to speculate. I mean, when you reach the point where, in order to be evacuated as a Ukrainian soldier or officer from the battlefield where you were severely wounded, that you have to bribe the ambulance crew to take you to a location where you can receive real medical attention, it's over. There's no military infrastructure to take care of anyone. People are simply being herded into gunfire. This war is over. The Russians are moving deliberately and slowly towards the West. And the great lie that Putin wants to conquer Eastern Europe is falling apart. And that's beginning to happen in Germany and Austria and France and elsewhere. Finally, after months of lies after lies after lies, the populations are beginning to say, what? What's really happening? I'm looking around and my economy is destroyed. Our jobs are vanishing. And we are overwhelmed by foreigners, unwanted migrants, people that are in our country. We never asked for them. The government never consulted with us. The government simply said, if you don't accept millions of foreigners into your midst, well, then you're a Nazi. Then you're a bigot. And people are saying, no, wait a minute. This has nothing to do with being a Nazi. This is about the survival of the French nation, of the German nation, and so forth and so on. All of these things are coming together. Meanwhile, inside the United States, Americans, many of them, quietly are saying, wait a minute, more money for Ukraine? This war's over, isn't it? It's essentially gone. Just look at the map. Look at the advance of the Russian forces. The Russian forces are now in pristine condition. They're the strongest and most powerful military establishment on the planet. What are we? We can't even man the armed forces. We can't recruit men to come into the armed forces, which is what we desperately need, who can fight the enemy. We're recruiting everything other than the men that we have historically depended upon for decades. This is in the Navy, the Air Force, the Army. And now we're being told, well, that's fine. Recruit foreigners, recruit illegal migrants, bring them in. So now we no longer expect Americans to defend America. And Americans don't want to become part of this foreign constabulary that people like Senator Dick Durbin and others want to stand up. Perhaps it's because they feel safer if foreigners have the guns in their country. Incomprehensible to me, but that certainly looks like it's the case. And the criminality rises. The poverty is increasing. A 35% increase in food over just the last 18 months. This is insane. What do you do if you're just the average American family? You don't live in a gated community in a specialized apartment complex in Manhattan. You don't live in a gated community on the outskirts of Washington. You have to live in the real world, and that world looks pretty bad from your standpoint. No one in Washington really either cares or gets it. Washington is a planet unto itself. And then this horrific attack on the 7th of October, which shocked and appalled everyone in the world, including all of the elites in the Muslim world. All the elites in the peninsular Arabs, the Egyptians, Turks, Iranians, everyone was shocked and appalled by that. But what's happened? Instead of looking specifically at that event and trying to deal with it, it has now become the justification for essentially expelling and killing 2.2 million people from a place called Gaza, because it's being exploited as the means of creating this greater Israel that has always been on the agenda, but has not been created. And that includes the West Bank and Gaza. And that's a fact. That's not really open for debate. We know that's happening. And in the meantime, the rest of the world is now more shocked and more appalled by what's happening in Gaza than they were about what happened on the 7th of October. And America is sitting there saying, well, we have to help our Israeli friends, but people are watching the images. They're listening to what's seeping through the media net and finding out, my God, there are over 18,000 people dead, 6,000 children. How does it help the Israeli cause? How does it help us? Because we stand with the Israelis. These things are beginning to sink in, but not enough to make a difference inside the United States. For the most part, the Hill is still a permanent fugitive from accountability. They're busy taking the money from the lobbyists, taking the money from contributors, the big donors, in donor-occupied territory called Washington, and they're going home and sleeping comfortably at night. That's where we are.
It is. It is a city unto itself. It's like the Capitol in the Hunger Games. It's totally isolated, and it lives in its own bubble. And, of course, all of these members of Congress take money. They take massive amounts of money from the military-industrial complex. They take massive money from the Israeli lobby, and they get up there on television and they put on a circus and a little song and dance, and they raise more money and more money flows into them. And the American people are totally separated from that. And if you ask the American people, do you want to send money? Should we be sending money to Israel? Should we be sending money to Ukraine? Overwhelmingly, Americans say no. Overwhelmingly. Just look at the polling on that. Overwhelmingly. And yet there's totally disconnected from that.
Listen, you're making an important point, and that is that historically, if you go all the way back to the first part of the 20th century before World War I, the American population has always been opposed to military interventions overseas. The sentiment never swung very strongly in favor of World War I, and it didn't last very long. When we sustained 318,000 casualties in 110 days, people began asking then, what are we doing? What's this for? And when they discovered that we were there to rescue British and French banks and British and French imperialism, millions of Americans became very, very disgusted and permanently alienated. It took the Pearl Harbor disaster, which we now know was actively cultivated and shaped by FDR, to really bring us out of this quote-unquote isolationist sentiment. And that isolationist sentiment is still there right now because people are simply saying, what about our problems here? So there's no question the polling data supports what you're saying. But remember, donors win elections, not voters.
Right. Yeah, sadly. Maybe that's why Lindsey Graham, just speaking out, I want to play this for you and get your take on this as it relates to Ukraine. We've got so much to cover here, and I want to get your take on this. So this is Lindsey Graham telling us why he's thrilled that we'll fight till the last Ukrainian, that this is great for America and this is great for Ukraine. Listen.
Here's the strategy. Everybody in Ukraine's strategy is to fight to the last person. We finally have an ally willing to fight. We haven't lost one American in the fight to liberate Ukraine. We spent about 5% of our defense budget, not lost one troop, and destroyed half of the Russian military. So at the end of the day, we need to help Ukraine get to Crimea and sue for peace on terms favorable to us. To all the people out there talking about Ukraine, can you promise me Putin's going to stop? Can you promise me that China won't invade Taiwan if we show...
So his idea is that Putin's not going to stop and that this is great news. We have an ally in Ukraine that's willing to literally kill every Ukrainian, and he thinks that's a good thing. They'll fight to the last Ukrainian, and he's praising this. And by the way, we've destroyed half of the Russian military. Okay, can you unpack that for us?
Well, let's start with his assertions about Ukraine. Our friend Zelensky is increasingly a Mussolini-like figure. He has become incredibly unpopular, widely hated inside Ukraine. He's already hated by his generals and most of the officers that are trying to keep what is left of the Ukrainian army together. Now, it's all one giant corrupt syndicate. We understand that. But at some point, even the officers in the field who've been pocketing the pay of their soldiers in many cases who've long since expired on the battlefield, they've begun to feel the heat, and they're beginning to say, this is over. Our future is grim. The Russians are coming. They will not stop. And they are stronger and better equipped and better officered, better led, better trained than they've ever been. It's time for us to find a way out of this. So what he's saying about Russia is just a bold-faced lie. I mean, Russia's economy is going gangbusters right now. And as you pointed out, I think as we were talking earlier, 20% of the transactions that Russia conducts are in dollars. Well, Russia is part of BRICS. Russia is about to become president of BRICS next year. And these are the states that are trying to distance themselves from our financial system. Most of them want to disengage. They're moving towards gold-backed currency, something we cannot do without ultimately confronting default almost immediately. Now, that's not something that Putin did to us. We've done that to ourselves. But the point is, the whole world is first of all, appalled at the United States. We're seen as the international bully who tries to push people into policies and actions they would otherwise never take. And we rely on two things. We rely on the financial system to bully them and the SWIFT operation, and we rely on military power. Well, our military power has taken a beating in Ukraine. He says not a single American troop or soldier has been killed or wounded over there. Well, we're not so sure. We've had a lot of people on the ground over there that may not have been in U.S. uniform, and no one is reporting what's happened to them. A lot of British and American officers and soldiers have been wounded or killed as advisors or as supporters, as contractors. But, that doesn't matter. That's, of peripheral importance to Lindsey Graham. The point is we haven't committed the U.S. Army to Ukraine, and thank God, because if we had sent it into Ukraine, I don't think it could have sustained itself logistically for more than 100 kilometers. And then I think it would have been beaten severely because warfare has changed. Russia is now on the leading edge of this new phase in the development of warfare in international relations. We don't get it. We don't want to recognize it. And of course, the people in the Defense Department and in the defense industries are very upset. They want to keep producing whatever it is they already produce because that's guaranteed income. People are not looking carefully at what's going on and what has happened in Ukraine. So I think Lindsey Graham in many ways typifies, even though others don't say the things that he does, but many of the members on the Hill. And he continues to remind our opponents around the world that as long as American soldiers don't die in great numbers at any given point in time, well, the U.S. government can act like a fugitive from accountability. It can make war on anybody it likes. It can take on and destroy human beings anywhere, including inside our country, who disagree with it. That's a pretty frightening prospect. And I think it also sends a message that if you can find a way to kill a large number of Americans, gosh, I guess that's the way to induce people to change.
What is your assessment of where things head with this war next? Is NATO... Are we seeing we are seeing a massive NATO provocation marching right up into their doorstep? Do you think that the neocons in Washington will win the day and force the United States into a broader war directly with Russia? Or will they end up admitting defeat and go home with their tail between their legs and allow Ukraine to be carved up and sliced up? I mean, what is going to happen, do you believe, over this next year in 2024?
Well, you already have a number of people on the neocon side, like Larry Fink, and he owns, or his firm BlackRock owns, controlling interests in firms like Monsanto. They have their eyes on the rich and fertile soil in Ukraine. That includes Western Ukraine, as opposed to Eastern Ukraine, which is now largely lost to them. And I'm sure that they have every intention of going into that country and carving it up and trying to make use of it as they see fit. It's very tragic. And the government in Ukraine, which has betrayed the Ukrainian nation almost from day one, in my judgment, is certainly willing to cooperate with that as long as they get paid. So Ukraine's in very terrible condition, but no one in Washington will admit that. Instead, what I think will happen is essentially what happened in the aftermath of Vietnam. We left. We just left. We don't live in Europe. People forget that. We don't live in the Middle East. When things go badly for us or we don't like something, we just pack up our gear and we leave. And we act as though, well, nothing else happened. And people have said, well, we lost. Really? Where's the evidence for the strategic defeat? Well, the evidence for strategic defeat is all over the world. It's just kept out of view for the American people. We are now at a low point in our history, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, where we command almost no respect, no admiration, and very little support. Even our vassal states in Europe are walking away from us right now. All of the governments in Europe that have been cooperating with us are on the road to removal. None of them are going to last much more. And when those governments finally go, they'll be replaced by new ones, as we've seen in Poland. But even that one is not going to last for very long. Europe is in turmoil. But the one thing that everybody can agree upon is that we, Americans, because of our unrelenting hostility to Russia, have destroyed their economies, ruined their scientific industrial base, made them paupers. They don't forget that. So it's only a matter of time until we're ultimately going to be told to get out of Europe. People find that incomprehensible, but that's coming. It's very definitely coming. The European people are a little further down the road than we are in terms of understanding the extent to which their own governments have hurt them. We're not quite as far along yet. We'll get there, but they're ahead of us. We're going to watch sweeping changes in Germany, sweeping changes in France and other countries in the West that formerly behaved like obedient little vassals of the greater American empire. That's over.
You mentioned Germany. I want to ask you about that. Over the past few days, we've seen Chancellor Olaf Scholz put in place basically emergency powers. Now, in order to extend his budget to provide aid to Ukraine. But this, I think, is cover, of course. And a lot of people are drawing comparisons to the last time that a German chancellor enacted emergency powers. We all remember that mustachioed man and what it looked like when Germany put those emergency powers in place. What is going on here in Germany? We continue to hear the patina that, oh, Germany's fine, but you're seeing company after company closing their doors. Energy crisis in Germany after we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And it seems to me that something big is happening in Germany. What's your assessment of what's happening there?
Well, they also have a little man. In fact, the little man is Olaf Scholz, and he's being behind the curtain. The curtain is being pulled back, and he's saying the same thing that the left, or I would say, frankly, the Uniparty in Washington is saying, and that is, don't pay attention to the problems inside the country. Don't pay attention to our deteriorating economy. Don't pay attention to rising prices of food. Don't pay attention to the open borders and the human trafficking, the drug trafficking that is killing 100,000 Americans every year. Don't pay attention to the sexualization of our children, the pedophilia epidemic, and the attempts to legitimate it that are going on at the WEF and also in Washington. Don't pay attention to those things. You have the same thing with Olaf Scholz. Only Olaf Scholz is saying, look at the danger in Ukraine. The Russians are coming. Well, yeah, the Russians are coming if you're in Kiev, but they're not coming to Germany. They're not coming to Poland, and they don't want to. Who in their right mind in Moscow wants to rule Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Germans, Slovaks, Hungarians, and Romanians? Are you insane?
You imagine that Thanksgiving dinner? No way.
Yeah. I mean, there's nobody in Moscow that's remotely interested in that. What Moscow wants is an end to the war. They want a territorial settlement. Now, what that looks like, I don't know. But if we were interested in ending this war, anybody in Europe that wanted to end it, all you had to do is go forward and say, first of all, number one, today, ceasefire, all fighting stops. Secondly, then based on where everyone is right now, we come up with a way to disengage the fighting forces. You move back X number of kilometers. The opponent moves back X number of kilometers. Everyone settles in and tries to stay warm for the next couple of months, and we have a conference somewhere, clearly not in Washington, but somewhere that sorts out the child. The Russians who live in eastern Ukraine are going to live in Russia. End of discussion. The question is, how much more territory will be lost to the Russians as a matter of national Russian security? And that's important, because it is Russian national security that we ignored and abused and discarded. That's what brought on this war. I don't know what that looks like, but it's going to be something. Then in the meantime, what happens in Ukraine? Are we going to step in to try and ameliorate the humanitarian crisis? Are we going to take our fingers away from control of the government in Kiev? Are we going to let the Ukrainians that remain there put something else together? Can we get other neutral powers to move in and help and assist in this process. And whatever emerges will be neutral in terms of a rump Ukraine, whatever that consists of, because it cannot be a member of NATO. And if anybody in Moscow questioned whether or not NATO and the United States were hostile to Russia, that question is being answered. I mean, we have just essentially poured our hatred into the public forum for everything that is Russian. We have no credibility there. The Russians have no reason to believe us. So they are going to demand certain things for their own national security. We have very little to say about it. And when you move to the Middle East, that's another situation which we begin that by saying we are behind Israel. We are. I've always been behind Israel. But things have moved in directions that we didn't expect. We're looking at the real potential for a regional war. Now, we had that potential in Eastern Europe, but that potential was rejected by Moscow. Moscow said, no, I don't want a regional war. You can try to provoke me. I will not be provoked. We are here for limited aims, limited purposes. We're not interested in killing any more Orthodox Christian Ukrainians. We just want an end to this and then a stable outcome. You don't have that in the Middle East. What's ensued now is this massive wave of hatred. Hatred breeds more hatred. And what's been happening in Gaza has mobilized hundreds of millions of Muslims on a scale that I don't think anyone has seen, certainly for centuries. And you now have ongoing coordination and cooperation between Iran and Turkey and all of the Arab states, and everyone has concluded this must not be tolerated because it's been made clear to them that this is a war for their destruction. In other words, this is not just about Gaza. Gaza is viewed now as the future for everyone in the region. Now, that may not have been the intention at the beginning of this, but that's the perception now. And that's the precipice over which a regional conflict will fall and then crush everyone. And it worries me tremendously because, I'm someone who would like to see the Israeli state survive. I'm not interested in seeing it destroyed. And unfortunately, the path that has been taken to this point leads to destruction.
And you have those questions being leveled at the United States government, specifically the State Department, Ned Price, and others answering questions at the podium about genocide. And those questions keep coming up. And it's frankly very difficult for them to answer them. And now the Biden administration's stance, at least, President Biden saying the very same thing is, all of these dead Palestinians, these children, these women being killed in massive numbers, it's a tragedy. We've been telling the Israelis we can't have that. We've sent them strongly worded messages. We've told them verbally that we can't do this and this is bad. You can't kill these many children. And they can't deny it anymore. I mean, it's undeniable. The amount of women and children are being killed. The civilian casualties is unparalleled at this level. And so the United States government position is we're telling them not to do it. We're telling them not to do it. But at the same time, they're also sending them 2,000-pound bombs. So are they talking out of both sides of their mouth?
I think the important thing to keep in mind is that Mr. Netanyahu, who is a highly intelligent, dynamic man, whether or not you like him, he's brilliant. And he has far more influence and control in Washington than Mr. Biden.
Right.
Those are the facts.
I've said here on the show that he is the president of the United States.
Well, in terms, at least at the moment, he wields far greater power and influence. And I see no evidence that anybody on the Hill is willing to come to terms with anything we're discussing. And again, part of that is because of the mainstream media. The mainstream media continues to sort of spew nonsense, and people believe it. I mean, I've got friends that were fierce supporters of Donald Trump, and I asked them, what do you think and what are you doing? And they repeat all the tropes from the mainstream media. I said, now you told me that the last election was fraudulent, not to believe it. You told me that Donald Trump was right and everyone else was lying. Now you're going back to the poison well, the well that you said was poison, and you're inhaling this stuff. You're believing what you're hearing. Well, that's not going to work. People have to wake up and understand that media are controlled by people. Who owns the media should be a critical question. What is their agenda? What are they preaching? What are they pushing? You're not listening to some sort of objective distribution of factual information. I remember during the Vietnam War, which tells everybody listening how old I am, but I remember listening to Huntley Brinkley and, various noteworthy news anchors, people who were viewed as not necessarily as icons, but they were certainly held in high esteem because people were confident that they would tell the truth. And I remember how angry people were during the Vietnam War when it became clear, particularly with the Tet Offensive. Before the Tet Offensive, we had General Westmoreland and McNamara and Johnson telling everyone, we've won the war. We've turned the corner, similar to the things that you heard Generals Allen, McChrystal, Petraeus say about Afghanistan or Iraq. We've turned the war. We're successful. And then, of course, Tet revealed that that was simply untrue, even though, as they quickly pointed out, we killed large numbers of them. It didn't make any difference anymore. We had lost the war because we had failed to make the case to the American people. We had been lying, and we certainly never had a case with the Vietnamese. And now we know that we killed at least 2 million Vietnamese. The reason I'm bringing up this is simply because we have a huge problem with too many people that believe too readily whatever comes through the television from the cable news outlets. And that's killing us because they have to raise questions. They have to challenge what they're hearing. And the people who are spokesmen in the Defense Department or the White House or the State Department, they're clearly there to tell you and me and everyone else what we're supposed to believe. There is no unbiased presentation of facts. None. We're not going to get it.
Yeah, we're certainly not going to see it in the mainstream media. And if you bring up these things on live television, you get cut off. For instance, Vivek Ramaswamy during the CNN town hall bringing up January 6th and the truth behind January 6th, and they cut him off and go to commercial break. You can't ask these questions on national television. They'll be cut off and censored.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because this is a very dangerous development in the history of the United States. If you question things, if you raise objections to policy, it's now no longer a case where someone says, well, you're just stupid or you're uninformed. It's moved beyond that. You are now evil.
Right.
You deserve to be destroyed. Well, the
Right.
last people who used to say those things and then act on them were the Bolsheviks that created the Soviet Union. And anyone who raised objections or challenged anything or said anything in the Soviet Union, we know what happened. We know they killed almost 60 million people long before the Second World War broke out. We don't know how many millions died as a result of it, but anybody could guess. But the millions and millions of people that died because they had the intestinal fortitude to say, I don't believe that, should not be forgotten. I hear this sort of approach in Washington all the time. If you don't go along, you're evil, you're wrong. You deserve the worst. You should be doxxed. You should have no access to your bank accounts. You don't deserve to live here. You should be removed. My God.
We've seen that with whistleblowers. I mean, I've spoken with FBI whistleblowers who've blown the whistle on the corruption at the FBI. They've had they should be protected under whistleblower protection laws. No, the retribution is basically you should die. We should ruin your family. We should dox you. We should ruin your life. And that's where we are. People that are speaking out against child trafficking in the United States. I've spoken with multiple whistleblowers who've at HHS and ICE and others who've called out child sex trafficking and slavery. You'd think these people would be lifted up as heroes. Instead, they're cast out and seen as lepers, pariahs in society. It's a sickening state of affairs in the United States of America right now. And the tyranny of this government is incredibly concerning. I think all Americans should be paying attention to who's funding these members of Congress. Look deeply at where they're getting their money. When you see these members of Congress grandstanding during these congressional hearings, and they're grandstanding for C-SPAN cameras and other things, look at where they're getting their money and who's funding them to say these things.
My greatest concern is people like Lindsey Graham are beating the drums for war with Iran as though that's going to help us. We'll strategically benefit from it. It's insane. You don't go to war when your economy is in the toilet. And right now, ours is in the toilet. We're buoyed up by government spending. We just keep spending money through the government. That masks the underlying fragility of the economy. That can't go on forever. But you know what we're doing? Exactly that. People have said, well, it's worked this far. We're going to keep printing money and doing this in the future. Catastrophe. So I don't know what happens first. Do we implode financially and then come to terms with the economic disaster here at home before, we have another regional war in the Middle East that drags us in? Only this war will be against very formidable opponents. We have a false impression of the Arabs. We say, oh, well, they're just not very good. They don't know what they're doing. Wait a minute. The population is much better educated now than it was 50 years ago. They have access to technology. Look at the Houthis. I mean, the Shiite tribe in southern Lebanon. I just shake my head. We're now committing all sorts of naval power there to try and prevent these ships from being attacked. The Houthis have effectively closed the Suez Canal. Everybody's sailing all the way around the Cape. The next thing you know, we'll have someone in the Hill say, we need to declare war on the Houthis. Let's send in 10,000 Marines and we'll clean them out. Well, good luck with that one, because the British had very unhappy experiences in the mountains, both there and up in Pakistan. We've got to talk to people. We've got to get out of the business of threatening and bullying. And we've got to sit down and we've got to treat people with respect and acknowledge that they have real, legitimate concerns and interests. Then, if we go into the situation like that, we may have some success. Now, Putin was recently on a trip all over the Middle East, and I'm sure you and others saw how well he was treated. Same thing with Xi. I was laughing because Biden was in Vietnam recently. His trip came and went, very little notice. He had a quickie visit, and it was over with. Xi shows up. Xi gets a 21-gun salute. Xi is welcomed like, the emperor is visiting Vietnam. We don't get it. Putin is widely regarded as the heroic figure that stood up to us. So everywhere he goes, he's listened to. And the good news is that I think Putin has told the various actors in the region to exercise patience. And he's won in Ukraine through patience.
Through patience, right.
And I think he sees the same thing happening in the Middle East. In other words, please don't do anything rash at this point. Wait, prepare, organize, and wait. Don't interrupt your enemy when he's making mistakes. That's what an Israeli general told me. Well, it's time for the Israelis to listen to that very brilliant retired general who told me that. Because
listen to their own advice. Right. Listen to their own advice. Right.
And that general was right, and he's still right, and he's right today.
Fascinating. Well, Colonel, I want to get you out of here on this. Our Country, Our Choice. You're the CEO now of Our Country, Our Choice. Tell our viewers what this is, and give us some background on what this is. And I'll link it up in the description below, ourcountryourchoice.com.
Well, yeah, I would encourage everybody to go to the website and see what's there. But in a quick thumbnail sketch, I did not build this or form this. This was already in the process of developing and being built when I was asked to come in and be the CEO. And I'm very flattered that they wanted me there, and I'm happy to be there, because the idea is as follows. First of all, Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, have figured out it doesn't make any difference for whom you vote. You get the same outcome over and over and over again. This is where we began our discussion. Ask the average American in Seattle or Kansas City, you want to go to war in country X? You think we should commit 500,000 troops there or 50,000? He'll say, why? What? Where is it? No.
Right.
So, this is not new. So this is a group of people that says it's time to unify Americans across party lines. We need a third movement, a third way, if you will, that aims at certain specific objectives. First of all, we have to unify. We're too divided. Now, we can't overcome all the divisions, but we have to unify into a large mass that Washington can't ignore. Number two, we have to end these overseas adventures. We've got to come to terms with the new world we live in. This is not, about the post-war liberal order. That's gone. That went away in 1992. We're living in a new world where we have to live with others and we have to operate on the basis of mutual respect, and we have to focus on our strategic interests. Washington said no nation can be expected to move beyond its own interests. Well, we've been way out there, way beyond our interests for decades. That needs to end. And then secondly, there are other key issues. We've got to control the border. We need 60,000 troops on that border tomorrow. We needed them 2 years ago, 5 years ago. The United States Army, certainly from 1848 until 1946, was on that border. It wasn't an accident. All of the great generals of the Second World War, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton, Harmon, go down the list. They all served on the Mexican border. That was not an accident. We need to wake up. That border, it did not just become a problem. It's worse now than ever, but it's always been a problem. We need military power there. We need to keep the military power there until we have effective barriers and a surveillance system in place that can protect us. We can't expect the Border Patrol to do these things. They're outgunned, they're overwhelmed, and they're good people, but they can't perform Mission Impossible. And we're losing large numbers of them because they said, what's the point of me being here if you're going to let anybody who wants to come into the country come in? So that has to be dealt with. We must restore the rule of law. Start halting the criminals in their tracks. Harsh penalties, round them up, imprison, or worse. We have been too lenient for too long. We need decisive action in our cities and our country to combat criminality. Then finally, the next big one on our list is stop the sexualization of our children. It has to end. And in the midst of all this, let's stop tearing down our country. What kind of a government is it that tears down its own monuments, that tries to destroy its own history, and worse, replace it with some drivel that is fundamentally untrue, simply because the current government doesn't like the fact that all these white men came to this continent and built this country. This is absurd. It needs to go away.
So when will you be running for president?
I'm not.
So many of our viewers ask this on a daily. I can see it in the comments. They're always asking, when are you going to run for president? We need Colonel MacGregor.
I'm a big fan of General Sherman. And General Sherman was approached because, of course, Grant agreed to become president. Grant never wanted the job, by the way. Right. And that says something. You want someone who doesn't want the job.
Oh, right.
That's really what you want, but you're not going to get it. But at the same time, Sherman said, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. I've spent my life as a soldier, and I was very happy doing that. I'm sorry it ended when it did. I enjoyed the hell out of it. And that's who I am. And I'm happy to serve under any legitimate American president. And I think we've got a couple of legitimate candidates. Obviously, Donald Trump, for whom I have great affection and admiration. Also, RFK Jr., who represents Americans and an American way of life. And I take him very seriously, and I have great admiration and respect for him. Those are it. Those are the candidates. They need to be taken seriously. I don't know what happens with Biden's cabal. God knows.
Well, I encourage all of our viewers to go over to the website, Our Country, Our Choice. I love this platform, defending our elections, defending our borders, defending our children. Who couldn't get behind that? And we need to throw both of these corrupt parties out of Washington and perhaps start fresh. Colonel MacGregor, Merry Christmas to you. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you so much for your insights. And we really appreciate you joining us as always.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Merry Christmas to you and Natali.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.